Captain Jack Lee stared at the German officer standing before him with a white flag, convinced this was some kind of trap. It was May 4th, 1945. Hitler had been dead for 4 days. The war was effectively over. And yet here stood Major Josef Sepp Gangl of the Wehrmacht, not surrendering, but asking for help. "The SS are coming to execute the prisoners at Castle Itter," Gangl said in broken English. "We need your tanks." Lee's hand instinctively moved toward his sidearm. This had to be an ambush. But something in the German major's eyes told a different story. This man wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of failing to save innocent people. What Lee didn't know was that in less than 24 hours, he would fight the strangest battle of World War II, a battle where American soldiers, German Wehrmacht troops, French VIP prisoners, and even a former SS officer would stand shoulder to shoulder against 150 Waffen-SS fanatics determined to massacre everyone inside a medieval castle. And you're about to witness how this impossible alliance formed in the dying hours of the Third Reich. Let's rewind 48 hours. Castle Itter sat perched on a hill in the Austrian Tyrol, a fairy tale fortress that had stood since the 13th century. But there was nothing magical about what it had become. In 1943, the SS seized the castle and converted it into a special detention facility for France's most valuable prisoners. These weren't ordinary POWs. Inside those ancient stone walls were 2 former French prime ministers, Édouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud, bitter political rivals who hated each other. General Maxime Weygand, former commander-in-chief of the French army, General Maurice Gamelin, another former French military chief, Jean Borotra, a legendary tennis champion who had become a resistance fighter, François de la Roque, leader of a major French political movement, and Marie-Agnès Caillot, sister of Charles de Gaulle himself. The Nazis had kept them alive as potential bargaining chips, but by May 1945, with the Reich collapsing, these prisoners had become liabilities. Dead men tell no tales, and the SS knew it. On May 2nd, the commander of Dachau, the concentration camp that administered Castle Itter, fled to the castle in panic as American forces liberated Dachau. He locked himself in his quarters and shot himself in the head. The sound of that gunshot changed everything. The SS guards at Castle Itter realized the war was lost. At dawn on May 4th, they abandoned their posts and fled into the mountains, leaving the prisoners in control of the castle but trapped. The roads were still crawling with SS troops setting up roadblocks and machine gun nests. These weren't regular Wehrmacht soldiers looking to surrender. These were Waffen-SS fanatics from the Death's Head units, feared across Europe for their brutality and their fanatical loyalty to a dead Führer. The prisoners knew what was coming. The SS would return to eliminate witnesses, to murder anyone who could testify about their war crimes, to erase any evidence of their existence before the Allies arrived. And the nearest American forces were miles away, with no idea that some of France's most important political figures were trapped in a castle surrounded by killers. The prisoners had already sent out one man, a Yugoslav handyman named Zvonimir Chuchkovic, who had left the castle 2 days earlier pretending to run an errand. He had walked 40 miles through enemy territory to reach American lines near Innsbruck. The Americans had listened to his story, but the castle was outside their operational area. A rescue team had been dispatched anyway, but they'd been turned back halfway by heavy shelling. The prisoners at Castle Itter had no idea if Chuchkovic had even survived. They were on their own. That's when Andreas Krobot, the castle cook, volunteered for a suicide mission. "I'll go to Virgil," he said. "Maybe I can find help." Virgil was only 5 miles down the mountain, but it was occupied by SS troops. Everyone in the room knew Krobot would likely be caught and shot. But what choice did they have? Krobot slipped out of the castle on May 4th in the morning darkness, riding a bicycle down the winding mountain roads. When he reached Virgil, his worst fears were confirmed. The town square was filled with black-uniformed SS soldiers, loading ammunition, checking weapons, and he overheard fragments of their conversation. They were talking about Castle Itter. They were planning to march up that mountain and kill everyone inside. Krobot's blood ran cold. He was about to turn around when a hand grabbed his arm and yanked him into an alley. Krobot spun around, ready to fight, and found himself face to face with a German officer, Major Josef Gangl of the 25th Nebelwerfer Artillery Regiment. "You're from the castle, aren't you?" Gangl whispered. Krobot nodded, too terrified to speak. Gangl's next words were the last thing Krobot expected to hear from a Wehrmacht officer. "I'm going to help you." Major Josef Gangl was a decorated veteran who had fought in France, survived the Eastern Front, lived through Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge. He had seen enough death to last 1,000 lifetimes, and in the final weeks of the war, watching the SS execute civilians for the crime of wanting peace, Gangl had made a decision. He had secretly joined the Austrian resistance, supplying them with weapons and intelligence. The war was over, Germany had lost, and Gangl was damned if he was going to let fanatics murder innocent people in the name of a dead tyrant. "I know some Americans," Gangl told Crobot. "I can take you to them." What Crobot didn't know was that Gangl had already made contact with American forces, negotiating the surrender of Wurgl. The Americans had been skeptical at first. A German officer offering to surrender a town. It could be a trap, but Gangl had proven his sincerity by providing intelligence about SS positions and helping to prevent a bloodbath. Gangl drove Crobot out of Wurgl in his military vehicle, flying a white flag. They headed toward Kufstein, where elements of the 12th Armoured Division had established a forward position. Captain Jack Lee of the 23rd Tank Battalion had just finished clearing Kufstein and was preparing to advance deeper into Austria when a German vehicle approached, flying a white flag. Lee ordered his men to defensive positions. This could be a surrender, or it could be a German trick to locate American artillery positions before launching a counterattack. The vehicle stopped 50 yards away. A German officer stepped out, hands raised. Beside him was a civilian. Lee walked forward, Thompson's submachine gun ready. "I am Major Gangl of the Wehrmacht," the German officer said. "I have come to ask for your help. There are French prisoners at Castle Itter, important prisoners. The SS are planning to execute them. We need tanks to defend the castle." Lee's first instinct was to arrest them both. Germans asking Americans for help? Impossible. But Crobot corroborated the story, providing details about the prisoners. Former prime ministers, generals, the sister of Charles de Gaulle. If what they were saying was true, rescuing these prisoners could be a major intelligence coup. And if it was a trap, Lee had tanks and infantry. He could handle it. "How many men do you have?" Lee asked Gangl. 10 soldiers, Gangl replied. "Loyal men who will fight the SS." Lee made a decision that would define his military career. "I'll help you, but if this is a trap, you'll be the first one I shoot." Gangl smiled grimly. "If this is a trap, Captain, I'll already be dead." Lee assembled a relief force. 14 American soldiers, including his tank crew and infantry support. 1 M4 Sherman tank, which his crew had affectionately nicknamed Besotten Jenny. It wasn't much, but it was all Lee could spare without abandoning his position at Kufstein. Gangl led them back toward Castle Itter, navigating back roads to avoid SS patrols. The drive took hours, and with every passing minute, Lee wondered if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. They arrived at the castle after nightfall on May 4th. Lee expected to find cowering prisoners. Instead, he found men who had armed themselves with rifles and submachine guns left behind by the fleeing SS guards, preparing to defend the castle on their own. These weren't helpless victims. These were France's political and military elite, men who had commanded armies and governed a nation, and they were ready to fight. But there was one more surprise waiting for Lee. Among the prisoners was an SS officer. Captain Kurt Siegfried Schrader had been recovering from wounds at the castle, assigned there by the SS Medical Corps. When the guards fled, Schrader had made a choice. He stayed, not to guard the prisoners but to help defend them. Schrader had become disillusioned with the Nazi regime, sickened by the SS's war crimes. When the prisoners asked him to organize their defense, he agreed. Now here stood an American captain, a German major, and an SS officer, planning how to defend a castle against Waffen-SS fanatics. If you had told any of them a year ago that they would be working together, they would have called you insane. But war creates strange circumstances, and the enemy of my enemy becomes my ally, even if that alliance lasts only one night. Lee took command of the defense, assessing the castle's fortifications with a professional eye. Castle Itter was old, but it was still a fortress, stone walls 3 feet thick, a gatehouse that could be defended with minimal manpower, high ground with clear fields of fire. The castle had been designed 700 years ago to withstand medieval sieges. It could hold against modern infantry, at least for a while. Lee positioned Besotten Jenny at the castle gate, using the tank as a mobile fortress to block the main entrance. He placed machine gun teams on the walls, mixing American, German, and French defenders. The prisoners, despite Lee's orders to take cover, insisted on fighting. Former General Weygand helped man a 30 caliber machine gun. Jean Barotra, the tennis champion, took a rifle and positioned himself at a window overlooking the approach road. These men had spent years in captivity, powerless and humiliated. Now they had a chance to fight back. Jangal used his radio to contact the Austrian resistance in Virgil, requesting reinforcements. The response was devastating. The resistance could only spare 2 more German soldiers, and a teenage Austrian fighter named Hans Waltel. That was it. Lee did the math. He had 14 Americans, 13 Germans counting Jangal's men and Schroeter, maybe 10 French prisoners capable of fighting, and 1 tank, against an estimated 150 SS troops equipped with machine guns, anti-tank weapons, and an 88mm artillery piece. The odds were, frankly, suicidal. "We can hold until reinforcements arrive," Lee told the assembled defenders. "The 142nd Infantry is pushing this direction. If we can hold for 12 hours, maybe 18, they'll reach us." Jangal nodded. "And if they don't reach us in time," Lee checked his Thompson's magazine, "then we make the SS pay for every inch of this castle." Night fell on May 4th, and the defenders waited. Around midnight, they heard movement in the trees surrounding the castle. The SS had sent a reconnaissance team to probe the defenses, testing for weaknesses. Rifle fire cracked out from the tree line. The defenders returned fire, muzzle flashes lighting up the castle walls. The SS probing attack lasted 20 minutes, then withdrew. They had learned what they needed to know. The castle was defended, but not heavily. The real assault would come at dawn. Inside the castle, the defenders prepared for the battle of their lives. American soldiers shared cigarettes with German troops who had been trying to kill them a month ago. French prisoners loaded magazines alongside SS officers who had guarded them, and everyone understood that when the sun rose, they would either stand together or die together. At 4:30 a.m. on May 5th, the sky began to lighten, and that's when they saw them. SS troops emerging from the forest, 100 to 150 men in black uniforms, spreading out across the open ground in front of the castle. They moved with professional precision, establishing firing positions, setting up their 88mm gun on the road leading to the castle gate. This wasn't a disorganized mob. This was a trained military unit preparing a coordinated assault. The commander was Oberfuhrer Georg Bochmann, a fanatic who believed the war could still be won if only traitors and defeatists were eliminated. And in Bochmann's mind, anyone who wasn't fighting to the death was a traitor. The defenders at Castle Itter, both the Germans who had defected and the prisoners who represented defeated France, were traitors who deserved execution. At 5 a.m. the SS opened fire. Machine gun rounds hammered the castle walls. The 88mm gun fired directly at Besotten Jenny, the shells screaming past the tank and impacting the castle gate with earth-shaking force. Lee's tank returned fire, its 75mm gun and coaxial machine gun blazing. The castle had become a fortress under siege, medieval stone walls withstanding 20th-century weapons. The SS infantry rushed forward, trying to reach the castle gate before the defenders could react. But Lee had positioned his men perfectly. Crossfire from the walls cut down the first wave of attackers. American and German soldiers fired side by side, their bullets finding SS troops who crumpled and fell in the open ground. The French prisoners joined in, and you could hear former Prime Minister Reynaud cursing in French as he fired at the SS from a second-story window. This was madness. This was impossible, and yet it was happening. For 90 minutes the battle raged. The SS would attack, get driven back, regroup, and attack again. The defenders held, but barely. Ammunition was running low. Besotten Jenny was hit multiple times by the 88mm gun, and though the tank's armor held, Lee knew it was only a matter of time before a shell penetrated, and then the German Major Josef Gangl, the man who had started this whole impossible alliance, saw something that made his blood run cold. Former Prime Minister Paul Reynaud had moved to a position on the wall where he had a clear shot at SS troops advancing on the eastern side. But Reynaud was exposed, leaning over the parapet to fire, and below on the bridge, an SS sniper had zeroed his rifle on the Frenchman. Gangl saw it happen in slow motion, the sniper raising his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. Gangl sprinted across the wall, boots pounding on stone. "Get down," he screamed in German. Reynaud didn't understand the words but understood the tone. He started to duck, but Gangl knew it wasn't fast enough. The German Major dove, shoving Reynaud out of the line of fire, and the 7.92 mm round, meant for the former Prime Minister of France, struck Major Josef Gangl in the head. He was dead before he hit the ground. The defenders watched in shock as the German officer who had brought them together, who had risked everything to save French prisoners, bled out on the castle wall. An American medic rushed over, but there was nothing to be done. Gangl had given his life to save a man who, 2 years ago, had been his nation's enemy. Captain Lee took command with renewed fury. "Make every shot count," he roared. "We hold this castle. We hold it for Gangl." The defenders fought with desperate intensity, but the math was working against them. Ammunition was nearly gone. The tank had been hit so many times it was barely functional. The radio operator inside Bezotten Jenny was frantically trying to repair the communications equipment to call for help, but another 88mm shell slammed into the tank, destroying the radio and setting the interior on fire. The crew bailed out, joining the defenders on the walls. Now they had no tank, no radio, and no way to call for reinforcements. At 7:30 a.m. it looked like Castle Itter would fall. The SS had breached the outer walls and were fighting in the courtyard. Hand-to-hand combat erupted as American, German and French defenders battled SS troops with rifles, pistols and bare hands. This was the end. Everyone knew it. And then Jan Borotra, the 46-year-old tennis champion, did something absolutely insane. "I'm going for help," he announced. Before anyone could stop him, Borotra vaulted over the castle wall, dropped 15 feet to the ground outside, and started running. SS troops spotted him immediately and opened fire. Bullets kicked up dirt around his feet. A round grazed his shoulder, but Borotra had spent his life as an athlete. He zigzagged, dodged, and sprinted like his life depended on it, because it did. The SS couldn't get a clean shot. Borotra disappeared into the forest, running toward where he hoped American reinforcements would be coming from. For 45 agonizing minutes, the defenders at Castle Itter held against overwhelming odds. Former generals loaded magazines. American sergeants fought beside German corporals. An SS officer who had rejected his oath fired at his former comrades. And everyone understood that if they died here, at least they had died fighting for something that mattered, saving innocent lives, standing against fanaticism, proving that even in the darkest moment of the darkest war in human history, enemies could become allies against evil. At 8:15 a.m., just as the defenders were preparing for a final stand, they heard it. The rumble of diesel engines, the clank of tank treads, and then American Sherman tanks from the 142nd Infantry Regiment crested the hill, their guns already firing at the SS positions. Jean Borotra had found them. He had run 3 miles through enemy fire, found the American relief force, and guided them back to the castle. The SS, caught between the defenders in the castle and fresh American armor behind them, broke and ran. Some tried to surrender. Most fled into the mountains, where they would eventually be hunted down by Allied forces. The Battle of Castle Itter was over. The strangest battle of World War II had lasted less than 4 hours, but it had changed everyone who fought in it. Captain Jack Lee would be promoted and awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He never forgot the German major who had asked for help to save enemy prisoners. The French VIPs were evacuated to Paris within days. They would go on to help rebuild France, their survival owing to an impossible alliance. Jean Borotra would return to tennis, but he never spoke much about his 3-mile sprint through SS fire to save his fellow prisoners. Kurt Siegfried Schrader, the SS officer who had defected, received a 2-year sentence for his Nazi Party affiliation, but the Americans who had fought alongside him at Castle Itter testified on his behalf, and his sentence was reduced. Major Josef Gangl was buried with full honors. The Austrians named a street after him in Virgil. He would be remembered not as a German soldier, but as a hero who had saved innocent lives at the cost of his own. 2 days after the battle, on May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over, but for the men who fought at Castle Itter, the war had already ended on May 5, when American and German soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder and proved that even after 6 years of total war, humanity could still triumph over hatred. You've just witnessed the only time in World War II that American and German troops fought as allies, a battle where former enemies became brothers in arms, a battle where a Wehrmacht major gave his life to save a French prime minister, a battle where an SS officer rejected everything he had been taught and fought against his own comrades, and a battle that proved that even in the darkest moments, when everything seems impossible, the right choice is still the right choice. The Battle of Castle Itter has been called the strangest battle of World War II, but maybe it wasn't strange at all. Maybe it was a glimpse of what could have been, if instead of following fanatics and dictators, soldiers had simply chosen to protect innocent lives. Major Josef Gangl chose that path. He paid for it with his life, but because of his choice, because of Captain Lee's decision to trust a German officer waving a white flag, because of Jean Barotra's insane sprint through enemy fire, because of every defender who stood on those walls. Some of France's most important leaders survived to rebuild their nation. And that mattered. That changed history. 2 former prime ministers, military leaders, resistance fighters, all lived because Americans, Germans, and French refused to let the SS win. Not today. Not ever. If this story of impossible alliances and last-minute rescues made you stop and think about what real courage looks like, about how enemies can become allies when they share a common cause, about how one German major's choice to do the right thing saved dozens of lives and changed the course of history, then you understand why some battles matter more than their size. Castle Itter wasn't D-Day. It wasn't Stalingrad. It was 30 defenders against 150 attackers in a medieval fortress in Austria. But it was proof that even in war, humanity survives. And sometimes that's the most important victory of all.